before we begin, I'd like to make a quick shout out to our $5 Patreon supporters, including our newest patron, Hannah. Thank you for supporting my channel. I love seeing your comments in all of my videos. I'm glad I have a fan. Hopefully my future content keeps delivering. Oh, hello everyone, I'm RV Micah and welcome to the show, where I'm having a bit of trouble with this game here. I have no idea how to get my guy to move. I'm holding this thing and it has like buttons on it. And if I press these arrow-looking things, do they make him move? Nah, that's stupid. Why would something in my hand affect something in the TV? That makes no... This game's hard! Okay, chances are you're not as brain dead as this fellow, but that doesn't change the fact that in modern gaming, tutorials are kind of a necessary evil as games get more and more complex. But some games do it much better than others. Sometimes a game is incredibly effective at teaching its rules, other times they either handhold you to the point of never taking off the training wheels or just leave you hanging. So how does one teach the controls in an effective way? That's what I'm going to be talking about today. So sit back and grab a controller, because today we're going to go look through a bunch of different games from different genres, both good and bad, and see how they get across their controls and mechanics to first-time players, all in an effort to learn how to build a better tutorial. Let's start with one of the more famous examples, Spiral Mountain from Banjo-Kazooie. First, and most obviously, you can skip this tutorial if you want to get to the meat of things right away. That is always a bonus for people who want to get right into the swing of things. However, Spiral Mountain is so much fun that even when given the option, 9 times out of 10, you'll want to play it anyway. When you first start, all you have access to is a pitiful jump. But as you explore the area, you'll learn how to do multiple kinds of jumps, a couple attacks, swimming, and climbing. But learning the moves is only half of it. Scattered throughout the stage are 6 honeycomb pieces, and collecting all 6 will increase the size of your health bar. Of course you want to collect them, and in order to get all of them, you not only have to apply what you learned, but you have to explore. And shock of all shocks, exploration is 90% of what the game is built around, so that's a lesson drilled into the player right this early in the game. But that's not all. All this is tied together by the banter between Banjo, Kazooie, and Bottles throughout it all. It tells us everything we need to know about the characters, and we get some fun banter between Kazooie and Bottles, and it's just super endearing. It's the rare instance where I actually enjoy characters who insult each other non-stop, and it really helps to have Banjo there just wanting to get it over with. Every time I pick this game up, I can't resist doing it all over again. This is just such a rare gem of a tutorial. Get it? Rare gem? You know, because the game was made by... Forget it. Banjo-Kazooie is one of my favorite platformers of all time, but another series I hold in equally high regard is Mega Man. I friggin' love the Mega Man series, but I won't be talking about Mega Man in this video, despite what the thumbnail might tell you. Egoraptor already did a brilliant analysis of how these games teach the player, and especially the brilliant and subtle ways Mega Man X uses its opening level to teach everything that the player needs to know. I can't really say anything about it that he hasn't already said. So instead, I'm going to take a look at a game that's a lot like Mega Man in terms of its mechanics. I'm sure it'll still have some lessons to teach us, and after all, if it borrows the structure of a Mega Man game, surely it'll also copy the good design, right?
Mighty number 9!
Look, make no mistake, Mighty number 9 is a dumpster fire of epic proportions. But a bad game can and should be used as an object lesson to avoid making the same mistakes. So what kind of first impression does Mighty number 9 make? Well, right out of the gate, you have unskippable dialogue explaining that you have to shoot enemies, so that's a good sign. I mean, that's a bit like starting a Mario game and then Toad runs in and says, "Hey! You fall down a hole if you die! So you need to jump over it, or else you're gonna die!" Note to self, never do that voice again. Now, this tutorial level has quite a few problems, but its biggest sin is the fact that it completely and utterly fails to communicate the game's main mechanic. Let me explain. Mighty No. 9's gameplay revolves around the idea of assimilating enemies. Essentially, if you shoot an enemy long enough, it enters a weakened state. Instead of finishing it off, you can instead dash into it and assimilate it, powering you up. So how exactly does assimilation improve your capabilities? Well, the game never actually tells you. All the game tells you is that assimilation is good and you should probably do it. Which, I mean, it wouldn't be so bad if it were just some optional technique that can make the game easier when mastered but you don't really need, like the double gear in Mega Man 11. But no, you're required to use this mechanic to complete the game. For example, there's this section later on where you need to assimilate this enemy here to gain the ability to shoot through walls in order to clear this burial you couldn't normally get to so you can proceed. Except the game never actually tells you exactly what assimilation does, so how are you supposed to know what to do? Well, actually, that's a lie. This game does explain assimilation. Somewhere in the tips menu. Because yeah, mechanics central to the game should definitely be buried in some obscure menus. Assimilation isn't the only thing that goes unexplained either. Alt-fire, for example, is never required of the player in the tutorial, or anywhere in the game really, and a friend of mine made it through basically the entire game without realizing it had an E-Tank equivalent. An E-Tank equivalent that sucks, but still. I should probably clarify, however, that just because a game is good doesn't mean that it'll be good at explaining its own mechanics. Some of the best games I've ever played don't do a very good job teaching the player. On that note, let's talk about Roller Coaster Tycoon 2. I don't have the box anymore. Roller Coaster Tycoon 2 is a classic. It may not be as beloved and memorable as the first, but this game basically defined my childhood. It's still one of my favorite games of all time. But one place where it decidedly does not excel is in its tutorial. There are a few tutorials instructing you on how to build roller coasters, other simpler rides, placing scenery. That's all fine and good, but when it comes to the management side of things, it basically leaves you to figure it all out for yourself. You see, Design Doc, another great channel, pointed out that RCT was such a groundbreaking game because no one had thought to combine a management simulator and a construction simulator in such a way before, and while the construction half of the game is very well explained, you're completely left on your own to figure out management. It never tells you how to set prices, how advertising works, etc. And I'll admit, a lot of the game's mechanics are pretty intuitive, even if you do have to feel around a bit to figure out how they work. But even when it does explain construction, there are still things that it leaves unclear. It suggests adding block breaks to make coasters run more safely, despite not actually laying out what exactly it is they do. And it fails to properly explain the most important part of coaster building, balancing the excitement, intensity, and nausea ratings. It never tells you exactly what makes for a super intense roller coaster and how to improve a coaster with low excitement. And that leaves the second major issue with these tutorials. They're completely passive. The entire time you're just watching, with the cursor explaining how to do things and you just sit back and do nothing. Remember that one time you learned math by watching someone else do it while you didn't have to pick up a pencil once? Of course you don't, because that's not how learning works. And while you can wrestle control away from the game during the tutorials, all that does is end the tutorial prematurely and there's no way to start it back up again without going back to the main menu. Still, it's at least better than what some games do. Planet Coaster is a game very similar to Roller Coaster Tycoon in many respects. However, its mechanics are much, much deeper than its predecessor of 20 years. So this tutorial needs to do a really good job of explaining how the game works. So how does it do that? Why, by not having a tutorial at all. Instead, it just links you to a couple YouTube videos that explain things. Again, watching and listening to an explanation without doing anything yourself does not a good tutorial make. So with that out of the way, how should a Tycoon game make a tutorial? If you've ever played a Tycoon game other than RCT, chances are you've tried out Zoo Tycoon. The tutorial is very similar, and while it does go over only the basics, it at least touches on every aspect of the game. But the real advantage it has over RCT's tutorial is that you actually control the game. Granted, you're just following the game's instructions the whole time, but still, actual interactivity. There's even a great moment at the end where it instructs you to delete a section of the lion exhibit, releasing the predators out into the park. So not only does it inject some much needed personality into the otherwise basic tutorial, but even back then, Tycoon games knew that screwing with your customers is a proud and time-honored tradition. Let's move away from Tycoon games now onto one of my favorite genres, the RPG. And loath as I am to admit it, very few RPG tutorials are actually all that great. Now, I mentioned before, Final Fantasy is my favorite video game series, but my oh my, their tutorials aren't very good. Every game seems to have its own complicated mechanic that takes a while to introduce, like Materia in 7 or the Sphere Grid in 10. These tutorials are kind of a necessary evil, but the thing is, they tend to over-explain things to the point of dragging things on for way too long and make things more complicated than they need to be. Final Fantasy VIII is especially bad at this. Not only is its main mechanic, the junction system, incredibly complicated, but it keeps giving you new tutorials every 30 minutes and keeps drip-feeding you new aspects every time they become available. It doesn't help that 8 has the most boring UI of the entire series. It's just gray blocks. It's so gray that I think I'm going colorblind just by looking at it. It's more gray than Dick Grayson. If you ask me, the best one of the bunch is Final Fantasy XII's explanation of the Gambit system. For one, it manages to make a deep and involved system seem really simple to understand. But if you ask me, the real reason is that the character giving you the tutorial is Balthier, one of the most entertaining and well-written characters in the franchise. The explanation carries his tongue-in-cheek, almost genre-aware tone of voice throughout, and it makes it much easier to follow. My favorite part is when he implies that those corpses you pass throughout the dungeon all died because they couldn't arrange their gambits properly, and beat each other to death because they thought it would heal them. So yeah, this game gets a pass, but most Final Fantasy games honestly do a pretty lackluster job teaching their mechanics. Especially 8. I mean, seriously, just because the characters are in school doesn't mean the player has to feel like it. But not all RPGs have this problem. Take Undertale, for example. Gosh, I really need to do a full video on this thing one day. Anyway, the entire Ruins section of the game is a perfect example of communicating what a game is all about right from the get-go. Of course you have Toriel literally hand-holding you through the first part, but it's not just that. Every enemy encounter is carefully designed to introduce a new gameplay mechanic. Whimsun teaches the player that some encounters can be ended through means other than killing them or sparing them. Vegetoids teach that different colored projectiles do different things. La Cucaracha teaches you that some enemies behave differently when alongside other enemies, etc. But then there comes the subtle manipulation of the player from the first boss fight against Toriel. The game teaches you that there are two ways to spare enemies. You can either perform a series of actions that allow you to befriend them, or you can attack them to get their HP low enough that they don't want to fight you anymore. Once you reach the end of the ruins, Toriel doesn't want you to leave the relative safety of the ruins for fear of Asgore finding you, so she has you fight her to test your ability to survive. And even though the game has given you the option to kill or spare up to this point, no one wants to kill Toriel. She makes you delicious pie. She purposely makes her attacks miss if your health gets too low. And she's just so freaking cute! So naturally, most players will want to spare her, but none of the action commands available will let you talk her down. So you figure, okay, I just have to get her HP down enough that I can spare her that way, just as long as I don't kill her. So you whittle her health down, taking great care not to hit her too hard, and then the game plays its first trap card. After her absolutely gut-wrenching death scene, of course the player is going to feel guilty, so they reload their last save knowing there's got to be another way to spare her, and there is. In fact, that exact method is what you use to spare pretty much all of the major bosses. But once you start talking to her again, something will be off.
That's disturbing.
But whatever, you figure out the proper way to spare her, and then you move on. Flowey shows up and has this to say. By toying with the player's emotions, the game was able to pull off the dramatic reveal that saving is more than just a game mechanic, it's part of the lore. And not only that, but this game taught you many recurring mechanics and taught you how most of the bosses are going to work from here on out. It's a great lesson that seamlessly leads you into the rest of the game with all the knowledge you'll need to conquer it. But Undertale isn't the only RPG that nails its tutorial. Another example that stood out a lot to me for whatever reason is from, ironically, a series infamous for its hand-holding. I know I'm going to be crucified for saying anything good about Pokemon Sword and Shield, but I'm sorry, I really appreciate how this game teaches the battle mechanics. As per the series tradition, your first Pokemon battle is against your rival, but unlike most games in the series, he actually starts the game with 2 Pokemon. His first Pokemon, Wooloo, has a low enough level that it's pretty much harmless. Your Pokemon only has 2 moves at this point, a damaging move and a status affecting move. It isn't going to take you long to figure out how to reduce your opponent's HP to 0, and you knock it out really quickly. which levels up your starter just enough that it learns a new move. Then your rival sends out his starter, and it's a bit more intimidating. And of course you're going to be drawn to the new move you just learned, so you select it, and wham! Super effective. Right out of the gate, the game was able to convey type advantage, and it didn't hold your hand either. You figured it out yourself, and it only told you what you did after you do it successfully. Pokemon, as I mentioned before, is notorious most of the time for its unskippable tutorials, since more often than not, they're aimed at new players. But some games have the opposite problem, where they take for granted that you already know how the game works and won't explain itself well. I had a uniquely frustrating experience with the second Ace Attorney game. If you don't know how the game works, here's the formula. The witness on the stand gives their testimony of the events of the murder. You press them for details, and if you find a place where the evidence contradicts their testimony, you present the evidence with a hearty "Objection!" and watch them squirm. Well, the second game introduces a twist on these mechanics without telling you. During this particular part of the game, I was completely stumped. The contradiction here is obvious. The victim supposedly wrote the killer's name in the wet cement, but it was misspelled. Odd, considering they were dating at the time. But no matter what I did, I couldn't get any of the evidence to fit that statement. I was stuck there trying to figure it out for like half an hour before I gave up and consulted a walkthrough. And you know what the solution is? You're supposed to present one of the character profiles. Bear in mind, this was something you couldn't do in the first game. This was an ability added for the second game that it never bothers to explain, or if they did, they just kind of glossed over it. I wouldn't mind so much, except it's the first time in the game where you need to object to something. Ease us into the new mechanics, will you? Now, for better or for worse, these are some tutorials that really stuck out to me for one reason or another. So, what have we learned today? Make the tutorial an actual part of the game, explain the why along with the what, cover all the game's mechanics and not just some, make the player an active participant, don't overcomplicate things, let the player discover things for themselves, ease them into any new sequel stuff, and most importantly, actually have a dang tutorial. That's all I got for you today. Join me next time as we dive into a game that was really done dirty on its initial release, as we take a dive into the oddest of worlds. See you next time!